We're now going to move into the Q&A, and Nicola and Chris are here to join me. So if you could prepare any questions you have. I think we're using the Slido application. I don't know if people are familiar with Slido. You go onto the website there, slido.com. You select #utilities17 and submit your questions. And then you can vote on the questions that other people have put in as well as to which one you would most like to have answered. So, Internet of Things, get your phones out and get ready. I'll get us going if that's okay, and then when the questions come in, we can move on to the screen. Maybe if we just start with where we are in terms of large utilities and where we're going into the new market. So we've heard a lot about water is going to go through changing. I don't know when we're going to get the first new entrant million customer water company. We've seen a huge amount of technology come in both into all areas of the energy system. Do the large utilities have the skills and systems to compete on customer experience?
Shall I start?
Absolutely.
I think the simple answer is probably not. Is the microphone working? The simple answer is probably not, and we need to do more about making sure that we do have those skills and expertise going forward. And I think many companies, most companies are deliberately trying to recruit and bring in different skill sets to the ones that a traditional utility would have. I think the thing I would say more than just the skills and technologies is probably about the culture as well, because the culture of a regulated utility is understandably and correctly probably different to a much more volatile, much more tradable commodity, much more customer-centric organisation. We want, and we indeed pride ourselves with our risk processes, our risk management systems, our cautious approach to change to make sure we have reliable, safe drinking water, which isn't going to pollute people, isn't going to harm people, and we aren't going to pollute the environment. So a much more dynamic, a much more short-term focus on the new skills for retail is probably something, skills but also culture. And I've got to say we had our joint venture board with South Staffordshire College yesterday, and we were looking at metrics which we'd never, ever, ever looked at before. You know, there's a switching of customers going on, there's pre-market switching going on now. We were looking at how many customers had switched in the pre-market across the nation, in our regional areas, why they were switching, what type of customers were switching, what margins were being switched. We never did any of that before. So probably we haven't got the skill sets, but we need to set up separate organisations and develop different cultures, I would say, as well.
Just add one thing, which I think probably you have some similarities in your business. I'm also always really impressed about the people who are out there on the front line, the way they talk to people when they're standing at a site in a street where they're making interruptions in the roadway. When things go wrong, the commitment that we get from our teams to being out there in not great weather, in difficult circumstances, is phenomenal. We had 2 quite substantial gas distribution outages in the Midlands this year, one lasting for over a week. And within that, we got 3 complaints. And that was all about the compensation that was available. And I think that is because we've got people who really go the extra mile in those circumstances. And so bottling that up and using that, I'm very grateful to them for the work they do.
Very good. Maybe another question then is about, we're moving into a world where we've talked about electric vehicles and the expectation that we're going to have massive growth in the electric vehicle usage. We're talking about moving off heating for gas and turning that into a lot of electrification. Do you believe we've got the networks and the grids and the infrastructure that we need to deal with the future demand growth that we're going to see from cars and from transport and from heating?
Yeah, I think that one probably was. It's one of the questions I think I had when I joined National Grid, and it's been fascinating to hear the number of different answers I get to that. And none of them are quite consistent. There are messages of absolutely we've got good, the backbone is good, or the way we use gas is changing, or we're going to be able to make gas greener, or actually the cost of changing every item in a household to properly electrify heat, that's going to be so huge that the behavioural changes won't be right. So you probably know we have this thing called the future energy scenarios, where we look out at different versions of the world and how that might look over the next few years or many years. I guess my answer is, I'm afraid I don't think there is a right answer yet. I don't think we know what the answer to that is. There are a number of initiatives going forward saying, okay, how do we go from the least worst regrets scenario, which I hear a lot. I've never heard this phrase before. I hear a lot in this industry, kind of the least bad thing to do, not this is where we think we should go, this will be helpful, this is a good future scenario. I've never decided that a regret is a good idea in my life. I don't understand why it's a good idea for an industry. So I think there are lots of activities underway to find a good way forward, and a kind of coalescing of the ideas around that way forward, and that I think is an important challenge.
I'll just do the corollary from water, if that's of interest to you. I mean, I think we have networks as well. It's obviously a different network to the ones Nicola has been describing, but we have water distribution networks and wastewater networks, and the amount of sort of the rate of asset renewal at the moment implies that these are going to last, certainly the wastewater networks, are going to last something between 600 and 1,000 years. Now, they're clearly not. They obviously are not, and we have to face up to the problem of reinvesting, re-engineering these networks sometime soon. And it's very interesting to draw the balance and the challenge and the trade-off between affordability, keeping prices low, helping customers who are struggling to pay their bills, but investing and leading into the future. And I think that's a debate that we haven't as a nation yet, and I think you mentioned Infrastructure Commission, didn't you? We haven't really faced up to yet as a mature, sensible discussion about these things. You know, we constantly hear people talking about the leakage rates in Berlin are massively less than they are in the UK. The leakage rates in Tokyo are virtually zero. Well, they are virtually zero because they have stainless steel pipes with flexible joints which are engineered to resist earthquakes, and they aren't clay pipes with concrete around them. They aren't 100 years old. So we have to face up to that one of these days, and we have to get real.
And what do you think, we're 500 metres away from the Thames Tideway Tunnel borehole. What do you think of the Tideway Tunnel model for delivering of major schemes?
Well, that's a very difficult subject for me because I don't want to intervene in there's an unspoken rule between us all as regulated companies not to speak about other people's difficulties. But clearly two things I would think about it. One is, and we've faced it in the southwest, and you know the reason we have the highest prices historically in the southwest is that at the time of privatisation, when the water industry was in state ownership, 40% of the raw sewage went straight out onto the beaches with no treatment. Totally unacceptable in this day and age. And a similar situation is happening in the Thames. When it rains like heck in London, we just tip sewage into the Thames. That is just not acceptable. So there has to be a solution for that. And the model that's come up has been a very interesting model. I know it's been, my colleagues in Thames Water have worked long and hard, indeed, I think you worked on it, long and hard about what is an appropriate model going forward. And this alternative self-contained special purpose vehicle with very, very, very low cost of capital. And it's quite seductive to say, well, we've put up a special purpose vehicle having cost of capital in the 2s, not the 3s or the 4s. This must be the way forward. Well, of course it was a very, very low cost of capital, but the only way to get that away was to have the government to underwrite the risks. And of course, if it's basically, not exclusively, a reasonably risk-free investment, the cost of finance is pretty cheap. And I think we just have to bear that in mind, whether or not that is really a model going forward, and whether or not the government would be willing to underwrite the investment in electricity, gas, or water distribution networks. I'm not so sure.
Okay, Nicola, I wouldn't mind turning to the questions on the screen. I think there's one about gas. A lot of talk about the growth in electricity in the future. What do you see as the role? What do you see for gas?
So coming back to my answer to the last question, I don't think people are in alignment about the future of gas. There are a range of potential scenarios, I think. A lot more gas going into generation of electricity, for example. Decarbonising gas input. We've got lots of experiments going on across the country, maybe innovation mechanisms rather than experiments. That sounds a little too chemical. And lots of things changing. As a result, we've got consultations ongoing at the moment called The Future of Gas. What do people think? And we're asking for people's input into that. it would be really helpful if you haven't already contributed and you have a view to put it in, because I think we do need some view on which to plan. There is a clear change coming, and one of the things the National Infrastructure Commission is thinking about is, if there does need to be a change, if we are going to move away from gas, when do any policy activities by government have to take place? So you roll back from 2050 and you say, okay, well, when has what got to have happened by in order to facilitate it? I have to say, at the moment, I'm quite sceptical about major change, because if you think 90% or more of households use gas for heating, that is a phenomenal shift in the way we use the built environment and the facilities we've got already built into homes across the country that we haven't started on. So I'm usually quite cautious about things that require big change from lots of people. So I'm pretty positive about the future of gas, but it may not look quite as it does at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
There was a question which I sort of scanned off the list about cyber. Do you want
Yes, about cyber and infrastructure.
I couldn't read it, sorry.
So it was a question about, given that we've got critical national infrastructure, how do we feel about cyber? And I'm sure your board is the same as ours. We have a lot of discussions about cybersecurity. And indeed, when the Queen opened the National Cyber Security Centre, she very helpfully, and I couldn't believe it, they said, here, look, here's a button you can press, and that can start an attack on the electricity transmission network of the UK. Oh, thanks. That's really helpful. Don't encourage people to do this, please. Anyway, so Queen, as hacker, clearly thought that she'd have a go at getting into the electricity transmission.
Press the button then, did
she did.
Yeah.
Luckily, it didn't actually have an impact on us. But I think that it highlighted that there is perceived to be an issue as well as a real issue. We're not talking here mostly about people sitting in their bedrooms just having a bit of fun. We're talking about the real threat from nation states. That's a big difference for people of the generation we are. Looking around the room, I think most people here didn't live through the height of the Cold War. We're talking about a really different attitude and thought process in the way we manage those networks. So it is a very current topic for us, and I think I'm guessing the same in water.
Absolutely, and it's something that you can't underestimate the significance of, because I mentioned, we're into public health and sanitation. That's what we do. That's a civilizing effect across the world. We are seeing, as you say, people testing, organisations, national or subnational, testing their ability to see if they can take control of water distribution networks, water treatment networks. And, so far so good. We're managing to resist those things. But these are real threats and real difficulties. And I do know there has been a case in America where someone from some state somewhere, you might speculate where it might be, has managed to take control of a waterworks in America. So this is about basic, polluting, killing people if we're not careful. This is very, very serious stuff. And as you say, boards spend an awful lot of time, risk committees spend an awful lot of time on that, and so they should.
Thank you. If there are any questions that people want to do in the traditional way, please also raise your hand, and we can do them for those that don't want to use the technology. I think we've talked a bit about, what have we got here? Do you foresee a perfect storm of disruption enabled by simultaneously coming of the automation, Internet of Things, AI, blockchain, and if yes, how do you prepare?
That's a good one.
So when I first met my team at National Grid, we did one of those, MBTI things. What type of person are you? How do you respond to things? It probably doesn't surprise you that I'm an extrovert, so I think best when I'm talking to other people. I don't think best in a hole behind. Whereas most of my team are introverts. They think best on their own. That's where they draw their resilience from. And when we talk about change, that puts us in very different camps. So we stood in our little groups, the extroverts, not very many of us, the introverts, quite a lot of us, and talked about change. And the extroverts thinking, fantastic, bring it on, we like it, give me more, I'm excited, what can I do, how can I attack it? And the introverts are thinking, why? Tell me why. And that difference between us, I think, is probably the way you kind of face that question. I face it with fantastic, great, This is going to be exciting. We can do things. So in the way Vincent was saying, he thinks there are lots of opportunities out there. But remember that we're taking with us an industry and many people who like to understand what the benefits of that change will be, where is it taking them, and why is it going to be of use? So that why question, which can sound a bit negative, but I don't think it is. It's saying, how do we get the best out of this? What is it that we are choosing from these things that are arriving on the table that are actually going to take the industry to a better place that is better for customers and that does make the networks and the markets work more efficiently together? So why, I think, is the question you have to think about which bits to take.
Yeah, just to build on that, and just to say I agree and see the same thing in my experience in the water industry and the waste industry, actually. But the point you made is that there's a passion and a commitment in these industries which they believe fundamentally they're providing this basic human commodity, this basic human right. And almost no matter what I do, the regulator does, the government does, you can't change that. It's there very, 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 very deeply ingrained. And that makes them cautious, but it also makes them an important resource to tap. And the similar point that you made, really, which is if you can get them to understand, if you can get their engagement, get their buy-in, you will have a huge probability of success because they believe this stuff in ways that other industries I've never seen before. They believe in what we're doing is absolutely the right thing to do. And if you can engage them in that change, they will be an unstoppable force, in my opinion.
And do you see energy and water as industries that are going to be sort of fast adopters of these new technologies and new ways of working? Or do you think that the regulatory structures will mean that that will always be sort of slower?
This chap in the middle shaking his head, no way. I don't know about you, but I think it depends on what you're talking about. So if you're, we'll be fast adopters of something, sure. That some things that will work really well for the systems that we have and the networks we have. And on the other hand, I don't think we'll be so fast that we're at the bleeding edge. Why? That would be the wrong place to be for me, in the sense that we'd be investing in things that aren't actually going to take us forward. So it would be a least worst regrets or potentially a most worst regrets. So I think that we probably won't be at the bleeding edge, but I think we'll be fast.
I think I probably agree with that. And I think the dimension of, will the regulatory regime constrain us? It's a very easy thing to say, the regulatory regime will constrain us. And certainly if I go back to that old model, which is, asking Ofwat's permission for everything, probably if you believe that's still where we are, you might see some constraint. And I used to argue that the 5-year cycle was not incentivizing us to take risks because we got penalized if we didn't deliver. If we took a risk which didn't deliver, we got penalized, we weren't incentivized for it. But I sense that mood has changed in the regulatory regime in Ofwat. I don't know so much about Ofgem these days. I used to be involved in Ofgem some years ago. But I don't know that... I think that's changed now, and I think if you make a persuasive case, if you make a convincing case to regulators and governments, they will embrace that. And we've done that, but not with the technology. But for example, I mentioned upstream thinking, catchment management solutions. It used to be the regulator said, what on earth are you investing in re-establishing peat bogs in Dartmoor for? Why on earth should you spend customers' money on that? But of course, you could make the cost-benefit analysis to say it was cheaper in the long term to avoid building the next reservoir, to avoid the carbon impact of all of the chemicals you needed to treat the water, to naturally capture the water, slow down the water. The government understood, the regulator understood, and changed their position. So I think, back to my leadership point before, I think you can overcome that regulatory resistance, which may or may not have been there in the past.
Now we've got the question there about where does new technology leave smart metering infrastructure? Will it be obsolete, bypassed? Perhaps if you could address that, and perhaps what is the technology that you think is most exciting that's coming into the market?
Well, the water industry hasn't been an early adopter of smart metering, and we haven't seen much benefit actually so far. And I think most companies are doing sort of trials and tests about smart metering. We haven't been able to make a convincing case that customers supported so far. The tests are close to what you and Vincent were talking about, is showing that you can do incredibly powerful things. So, for example, I have an elderly mother, I should be able to work out either through the electricity meter or the water meter whether she got up this morning, whether she flushed the toilet, whether she switched the kettle on. That sort of technology is available and can be used right now, but we're only scratching at the surface, and I don't think the water industry has been at the leading edge of that, and I don't think we've been able to persuade the customers that they want to spend money on that. And I know it's different in the energy industry, not for National Grid, it's for the distribution companies more than yourself, but I don't think we have yet.
Yeah, so in energy, I think first point is how much money are you putting through the smart meter, so why would it give the behavioural incentive for change? That seems to me to be really quite important, a bit like your nudge idea. So if consumers think there's a lot of value in using the smart meter actively, then I think it could have a big impact. So one of those scenarios of the future is lots of electric vehicles, as I said. If we're all charging our electric vehicles at home, that's using a lot more electricity, a lot more money going through your smart meter. I think people might be much more focused on the impact on them. So I can see some real potential for smart meters making a big impact at the time of big growth in electric vehicles. Otherwise, we're starting with sort of the people who are excited, as you always do with new technology and new movers. But I think we will also see, look, I've already said we had an afternoon with lower demand than the night recently. I think that will increasingly happen. I try not to say to my father-in-law anything about this because he simply says, yes, but I've still got a electricity storage 7 heating system and mine is better than everybody else's. But I do think that there are new ways of things happening that smart meters will help with.
Great. Thank you very much. Look, thank you to both my panellists, to Nicola and to Chris. So please join me in thanking them.